In 1945, inspired by the atrocities of 2 world wars, 58 nations resolved to form the United Nations with the dual purpose to, and I'm quoting now from the preamble to the UN Charter, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and also to, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The rest of the United Nations Charter was built on those dual goals of achieving a world where peace and human dignity were respected by states and protected by law. The Charter obliged member states to respect, promote, and encourage universal human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Economic and Social Council was set up to oversee human rights, including economic and social rights, and the first Human Rights Commission was formed. The first commission, as you probably all know, was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and that was the commission that dealt with the formation of the draft Universal Declaration of Human Rights. During the San Francisco conference, where the UN Charter was drafted and agreed upon, there was much discussion on whether or not specific human rights guarantees should be included in the Charter. There was many of the people thought that it definitely should be. Ultimately, it wasn't. There's no, in the UN Charter, there's no mention at all of specific human rights, but it was agreed that the very first task of the United Nations would be to form the Human Rights Commission and mandate the Commission to draft an international Bill of Rights. Now, one of the first decisions that the Interim Commission made under Eleanor Roosevelt was not to draft an international Bill of Human Rights, but to rather draft a document that would be instructive and persuasive rather than be legally binding on states. And I think that that was a wise decision, so they drafted the declaration. Now, just to let you know what the process was, because I think it's important for us to know the process because we're still in process. So as human rights activists, we have to find our way back or strengthen our ways of interacting with the ongoing process so that we make universal human rights a reality. So the process was, at first, as they received draft suggestions from all the countries and from non-government associations, and they also received a draft from the UN Secretariat. Those were all given to a Canadian, a fellow called John Humphreys, who was the first UN Director of Human Rights. He was a Canadian law professor, and he was given the task of drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, it went through many, many, many votes, like thousands of votes apparently, and yet the entire declaration was drafted in a scant 2 years from start to finish. And then on, as you know, on December 10th, 1948, the UN Assembly accepted it almost unanimously. There were a number of abstentions. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was accepted on December 10th, 1948, expressed ideals of universal human rights that are still inspiring and instructive as they were then. The UDHR begins with the affirmation that says, and I quote, "Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." Now, Articles 3 and 25 of the Declaration identify the core fundamental freedoms. Article 3 deals with the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Article 25 secures the right to adequate food, housing, clothing, health care, and other social services. The civil and political rights identified include, as you probably know, the right to freedom from torture, arbitrary imprisonment, slavery. It also includes rights to equality before the law and equal access to the protection of the law, the right to effective remedies for violations of rights granted by law, and due process rights. Social and economic rights identified as part of the right to life include rights to employment, to join a trade union, access to education, including education about human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Declaration ends with Article 28, which was then and is still now very controversial, and I quote, "Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized." The Declaration has been heralded by some as the most important document created in the 20th century. And on this 60th anniversary, we can surely celebrate the prescience, persistence, decency, and courage of the people who drafted it. And we can also celebrate the conventions and instruments that flowed from the Declaration, the instruments that provided substance to the rights identified in the Declaration, and also provided binding obligations for states to strive to respect, enforce, and make those rights universal. The instruments, these instruments heralded the intention of United Nations member states to cooperate to establish and maintain global peace and human dignity through international agreements that would be reflected and enforced in national laws and by the creation of legal systems governed by the rule of law. Simply put, what we mean when we say a system governed by the rule of law, we mean a state of affairs in which there are legal barriers to government arbitrariness and legal safeguards for the protection of individual rights. Some of the instruments that flowed from the Declaration and were inspired by it are the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination of 1969, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, both of which came into force in 1976, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which came into force in 1981, the Convention Against Torture, 1987, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, and lastly, the Rome Statute, which came into force in July the 1st of 2002. So we saw during those years between 1945 and 2002 many years of vigorous advances in the creation of international standards and principles that both restricted what states could legitimately do and obliged states to take effective action to prevent and punish violations of internationally protected rights, irrespective of whether those rights had been violated by states themselves. There's also been much progress in altering human rights, in bringing them into effect, and I'll just briefly mention the abolition of the death penalty of one of those areas where substantial progress was made, and then there's also been some slippage. So, for example, last year the UN General Assembly passed a resolution to ban the death penalty worldwide, and that resolution was passed by a vote of 104 to 54 with 29 abstentions. An optional protocol, the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is the optional protocol to ban the death penalty, and 68 countries, including Canada, have ratified that. 140 states have ratified the Convention Against Torture. I believe that that's the most ratified convention. Now I want to briefly talk about where do we stand now, and that's not such a happy picture. We'll start first with the death penalty. Last year, Mr. Harper, or perhaps it was Mr. Day, I'm not sure, announced that Canada would resolve from its position of lobbying for the clemency for people facing the death penalty in the U.S. and in other countries. So that was certainly a huge change in terms of Canadian policy with respect to the death penalty. So I'm just going to run through a few grim things in the world that you already know. So starting with the right to life, that has certainly been proven to be a right that is not universal. In Iraq, for instance, in the last 5 years, by conservative estimates, there's been more than 1 million people who have died as a result of the illegal invasion of Iraq, military invasion by a coalition, a U.S.-led coalition. Notwithstanding the fact that the invasion is admitted more or less to have been illegal at this point, nothing's been done to prosecute any of the people, to investigate or prosecute any of the people responsible for planning or carrying out that invasion. Another development, notwithstanding 140 states that have ratified the Convention Against Torture, and when a state ratifies the Convention Against Torture, that obliges the state to prevent and punish torture wherever it occurs, whomever are the victims, and whoever are the perpetrators. So in other words, it covers the prohibition of torture applies to state official, heads of state, and all countries ratifying the convention have undertaken to provide in what we call, I don't call it, so I shouldn't say we, what in Latin is called an erga omnes protection. So when a state ratifies the torture convention, they don't owe a duty to prevent and punish torture just to Canadians, let's say, and they owe it to all humankind. So notwithstanding that, torture is a policy which has been transparently adopted by some countries, for example, the United States, as a method of dealing with perceived security problems. And notwithstanding the fact that since the spring of 2004, we've had available on the internet any manner of reports, videos, and so on of torture, not one country has moved to prevent the torture at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay or Bagram, or punish anybody responsible for it. December the 10th, today, in fact, in Canada, in Ottawa, I guess because of the time difference, it's already over, but being argued in the Federal Court of Appeal is the appeal of the case taken by Amnesty International and the BC Civil Liberties against the federal government, asking for an injunction barring the turnover by Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan of detainees to the Afghan authorities on the basis that there was evidence indicating, quite overwhelming evidence actually, indicating a likelihood that the people turned over would be subjected to torture. In March of 2008, the federal court dismissed the application of Amnesty and BC Civil Liberties, saying that the case had been taken pursuant to the terms of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It hadn't been referencing the Geneva Conventions or anything like that. And the federal court judge said that the Charter did not apply to actions of the Canadian Armed Forces outside of Canada. So that's being argued today, and we can only hope that the decision will, the Civil Liberties and Amnesty's application will be successful. In Canada, we have, not to confine myself to talking about the U.S. because it's Canada that where we can probably be most effective. In Canada, as far as our war making is concerned, I just want to remind you of two things that were said by our leaders vis-a-vis Canadian actions in Afghanistan. Canada is now involved in a hopeless war against what has to be arguably the poorest nation in the entire world. In 2006, Mr. Harper said about that war, he was talking about the attack on the trade towers and the Canadian so-called mission in Afghanistan, and he said, Canada is not safe from such attacks, and we will never be safe from such attacks as long as we're a society that defends freedom and democracy. Nobody did anything about that. In July, 2 months later, Canada's then Chief of Defence Staff, General Rick Hillier, said, again in reference to the Canada's mission in Afghanistan, and I quote, "We're not the public service of Canada. We're not just another department. We are the Canadian Armed Forces, and our job is to be able to kill people." He went on to say that the Afghans killed and targeted for death by the Canadian Armed Forces were, quote, "These are detestable murderers and scumbags. I'll tell you right up front, they detest our freedoms, they detest our society, they detest our liberties." And again, none of us really did anything. Mr. Hillier wasn't fired, he wasn't chastised, he wasn't removed from office. In fact, when I heard him being interviewed on CBC, the interviewer was saying, "Thank you so much, General Hillier, for joining us today." Nonsense like that. Anyway, anyhow, so there we are. We're moving into an era where all around the world, in wonderful countries, safe countries like Canada and elsewhere in the world, governments are invoking emergencies and national security and worldwide terrorism as a reason to pass legislation and initiate policies that diminish human rights, increase the government's ability to keep tabs on individuals and exchange information with other countries, to detain people indefinitely without charges, to deny people the normal kinds of due process upon which any kind of justice relies. The situation for social and economic rights is just as grim. The gap between the fabulously rich and the profoundly poor worldwide is widening, with the profoundly poor group getting larger and the fabulously rich getting smaller. In British Columbia, in one of the richest, most beautiful provinces, in one of the most richest and beautiful countries in the world, over 20% of the children in British Columbia live below the poverty line. So where can we go from here? I want to end on a positive note by saying that one of the things I think we have to do is I think we have to cling to the ideal of working for a world where war is effectively prohibited, peace is assured, and the rights of all people are equally and protected, and all have access to the resources necessary to survive with dignity. So lots of times in the work that I do, people say, "What are you going on about? Things that were always lousy and always bad, and what can you do?" And I'll say that all of us can do something. I remember years ago being in a talk by Noam Chomsky, and he's very irritable with people that ask questions. Somebody stood up to ask a question. Have you been? It's true. Ask a question of what can I do, and the poor person, he said, "What can you do?" And then he said, "You can do something. You can do something." And then if that was a good thing to do, you'll do it again. And if it was a good thing to do, you get somebody else to do it with you. And so that's what we can do. I mean, there's many things. In Vancouver, we can do something about homeless people. We can do something about the right to house homeless people. But on a Canadian scale, what we can do is for non-government associations, we can work together. We can work more closely together. We can get more engaged with the United Nations, that many people say is failing, but that's all that there is as far as a global, an international system is concerned. And I'm very hopeful that if groups like ours can work more effectively with the United Nations, we could have a louder voice. So thank you very much for being here and listening to me.